what the federal government can do to improve K through 12 education at the local level so that we don't have another $7 billion spent as it was under Tiny Dancer Toady Arnie and Obama rebounder Arnie Duncan.
Oh, hey.
$7 billion spent to do nothing, at best do nothing, arguably to make matters worse coming from the Department of Education. What will Betsy DeVos do? What can she do with Congress? What can and should the federal government do to advance opportunity scholarships, competition at K through 12 at the state and local level? To help us explore these questions, we're pleased to be joined by Rick Hess, who is the Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also the author of the new book, Letters to a Young Education Reformer. And this week he'll be featured on our Against the Current series. I sat down with Rick last week for a long-form interview, so what we don't cover here will be covered in detail at upstream-ideas.com in my conversation with Rick, who joins us now. Rick, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure. Good to be with you.
So just by way of a quick background, I mean, you're not just a policy wonk. You're somebody who has been in the professorate. You have been a high school teacher, so you've been a practitioner as well. And I wonder if when you combine all of those experiences and you have this discussion that very much like Obamacare replace, there's consternation between conservatives and education reformers about what should be done via the Department of Education and Congress. Where do you come down on what can be done and should be done given the opportunities and pitfalls to advance competition, opportunity scholarships at the local level, particularly in places where they are not welcome at present, like, say, Chicago?
My bottom line is that schools are intensely judgment-laden enterprises. That's why autonomy matters so much to good schools, because it's about 1,000 little decisions made by educators and families every day. So my bottom line on Washington's role is that the more Washington gets involved, no matter how well-intended it may be, the worse off you're probably going to wind up, because Washington is not good at promoting autonomy or supporting judgment. Washington is good at driving compliance and rules. So one of the huge things that a Trump administration can do is take a sledgehammer to half centuries worth of accumulated rules and mandates on everything from use of federal funds to support low-income kids to dollars supporting special needs students, and make sure that educators and families have maximum flexibility to make the judgments they think best for kids. Where I do start to get nervous, though, is when we talk about big new federal programs designed to promote school choice. I think there's a lot of trap doors in that one that start to remind me uncomfortably of Obamacare.
So when it comes to education, you think the power should go from the federal government to state government?
Yeah, I mean, part of the trick is, if we were France or Cuba, it would be a different conversation, because in those countries, the federal government, the national government actually runs schools. In the U.S., of course, Washington doesn't run schools. All it can do is write regulations telling state education agencies what to tell school districts, what to tell principals. By the time you've played this game of telephone, even seemingly common sense stuff, like here's a way to make sure federal funds for low-income kids are actually supporting low-income kids. By the time you get to that end of telephone, you wind up with these bizarre accounting shenanigans that just leave teachers in a perpetual state of nervousness.
So when you talk about repealing a half century's worth of these regulations and stipulations and mandates to get money to the local level and have maximum autonomy to spend that money, how does that work? There's been a lot of kind of handles used to describe this. Is it just block granting significant portions of the Department of Education to the states and localities, but then if you drop ship it to states and localities like Illinois and Chicago, then you're just seeing that money used to fund the centralized bureaucracy. So how do you walk that line?
Yeah, so my bias is there's never a perfect solution to any of this, but my bias is if I got to trust somebody to make decisions for a kid, I'm going to trust their parents more often than I'm going to trust anybody else.
Yeah.
So for me, empowerment is whenever possible finding ways to make sure dollars are empowering parents to make judgments about what's going to work for their kids. One great model that we've seen in, close to 24 states is the McKay Scholarship Program that was launched in Florida nearly 20 years ago, which said if your child had special needs, you could certainly work through the traditional school district mechanisms and try to make sure that they were getting, the attention they needed, or you were allowed to take those funds and you were allowed to seek alternative placements. One entirely reasonable stance, I think, is to take the close to $20 billion a year that Washington spends supporting special ed and tell states that if they want to collect those funds, they have to give parents the opportunity to take their child's share of those funds for special needs kids. And if they are frustrated with the services or getting traditional systems, they're allowed to seek alternatives.
So
that would be one.
So how would that work though for the kid in a bad school, right? Is somebody with an intellectual developmental disability is much easier to identify than just your run-of-the-mill kid. I mean, I don't mean that pejoratively, but just your average kid in a classroom who's in a school that hasn't educated anybody in 50 years. So how do you get those same resources to that parent and that family to provide choice for that kid?
Yeah, and let's not overstate it. The federal share, the feds only pick up about 40% of special ed funds. And for instance, I am not comfortable with Washington telling states that they would then have to, to put the 60% of the funding in order to fund that child to private schools of their choice. Chicago Public Schools, for instance, winds up placing a number of special needs children in private schools,
right?
Sometimes paying $80,000 or $100,000 a year because it's not capable of meeting their needs. But once you get Washington in the business of telling states how to spend their funds, you have opened a whole bunch of doors that start to feel exactly like what the Affordable Care Act did to Medicaid.
Now, you mentioned more.
So the answer is it's only a partial solution at best. I don't want to overstate how far that gets you.
All right. You mentioned earlier about parental involvement over the government's involvement. Would you like to see the school's curriculum and have a say in that?
Parents do. That's, the logic of democratically controlled school boards, for instance, is that the U.S. has always been a nation where the expectation was communities would have a say in shaping the standards. That's why we talk about stakeholder processes, where school boards have a say in which curricula are adopted, or in the case of Chicago, mayoral appointees, I believe. But the real question here is if you live in a community and what the school board majority has decided is appropriate does not seem appropriate to parents, I think that's a problem. I'm more inclined to give parents more leeway to find schools where they, and programs where they find the curricula and the values reflect those they're trying to raise their children in, than to tell them, hey, you're stuck with whatever the majority of your community might happen to like.
I want to get your synopsis of your book, Letters to a Young Education Reformer, because I think it's a novel approach for the stories that are becoming legion of the hard-charging reformer who's a reformer until they're in the system and they get swallowed up and become a subsidiary of the teachers union. So just what the premise of your book and some of the letters to a young education reformer that are included.
Yeah, I've been doing this stuff for over a quarter century now, and as I said, my belief is that not only do our schools need to do better by every child. When I hear about achievement gaps, that's part of it. But honestly, I'll tell you what, we've got supposedly great suburban school systems where kids are still bored out of their minds, learning a lot less than I think they can or should. And the trick is, how do we improve these schools? Now, when you start thinking about how do you improve schools, 100,000 schools with 3.5 million teachers for 50 million kids, the scale of the project becomes daunting. So even smart, agile thinkers who, before they become government officials, believe in the power of entrepreneurship, believe in the power of communities and families and educators, that they need flexibility to design things that work for kids. Once they wind up in government, they magically become believers in giant, massive solutions, whether No Child Left Behind or Common Core or school improvement grants or universal pre-K. And then when these giant, big mandates play out in ways they didn't intend, they never seem to go back and go, wow, we didn't know what the heck we were doing. What they do is they say it's an implementation problem. They blame the educators for not doing it right. And then they move on and get a new big paying job at a foundation and leave it to be somebody else's problem.
He is Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. The book, which you should pick up, Letters to a Young Education Reformer, and check out our long-form interview on upstream-ideas.com as well this week. I've spoken to a lot of the nation's leading thinkers on K-12 reform, and Rick provided one of the more compelling interviews that I've ever been a part of. So definitely worth checking out. Rick, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.